The UN General Assembly is in full throttle this week, bringing to the stage the leaders who could together decide the fate of Middle Eastern stability. Today we heard from President Obama, and tomorrow we'll hear from both Iran's Ahmadinejad and Egypt's first democratically elected leader, Mohamed Morsi. It's a very powerful international stage indeed. But rhetoric aside, are there consistent underlying factors that will completely undermine a lasting peace? Joining me now to discuss more about foreign policy and how it could impact the potential for positive U.S. relations with the Middle East, I'm joined by the Director of New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, Phyllis Bennis. Thanks so much for coming on.
Good to be with you today.
So we just saw Netanyahu kind of making the talk show circuit really with some hard rhetoric about how the U.S. needs to elect a leader that takes a red line with Iran's nuclear capabilities.
Yeah.
And kind of dovetailing off of that, I wanted to play just a clip from Obama's speech about this issue.
Let me be clear. America wants to resolve this issue through diplomacy, and we believe that there is still time and space to do so. But that time is not unlimited. We respect the right of nations to access peaceful nuclear power. But one of the purposes of the United Nations is to see that we harness that power for peace.
So Obama's pretty much taking Netanyahu's wishes pretty seriously. We already know where Romney stands on the issue. Why is it that the U.S. has such why is it that Israel has such a heavy influence on such a delicate issue?
Well, there's two parts to that question. One has to do with this moment. We're in election cycle. Everything's about the election. And Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, seems to think that he has the right to weigh in on our elections and say who he wants. He clearly wants to elect Romney. He thinks that Romney's going to do a better job. In fact, all the Israeli leaders have actually said that there has been no U.S. leader who has been more supportive of Israel than President Obama, despite the occasional little squabble between the two leaders, you know, in terms of style. But substantively, this is all about the election. So Bibi Netanyahu's statements were what he thinks were going to help the campaign of the Romney campaign. In fact, I think a lot of people in this country are going to be pretty upset to see the leader of another country seeming to interfere in the internal affairs, as they like to put it, of the United States. Now, the reality is, in terms of what Netanyahu actually said about we need a president with a red line, excuse me, we've got one. There is an Obama red line. The problem that Netanyahu has is that it's a different red line.
It's not far enough.
It's a different red line, right. It's not, in his view, far enough. I think it's a terrible thing to have red lines. When you're negotiating, you don't set a red line and say, if you cross that, negotiations are off, which is basically what they've done. The Obama red line is that there will be no Iranian obtaining of a nuclear weapon. Now, everybody agrees that's a year, 2 years, 15 years down the line. Everybody in the U.S. military and intelligence establishment, through the National Intelligence Estimate, they all agree on three big things. Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, Iran's not building a nuclear weapon, and the Iranian leadership hasn't even decided whether or not to build a nuclear weapon. Having said that, President Obama is still saying, but there's a red line, we will not allow them to get one. Okay, so that means it's way down the line. For Netanyahu, the red line arguably is now. His line is, we will not allow Iran to have the capability to have a nuclear weapon. Well, what does capability mean? You could argue capability is what they've got now. They've got nuclear power plants, so they've got material that could theoretically be enriched to become a weapon, and they've got scientists with the know-how, except for the 5 who have been assassinated. But in that context, you know, this notion that there is no red line, says Netanyahu, it's simply not the case. He just doesn't like where President Obama puts the red line.
Having a red line definitely does inhibit a diplomatic solution to this whole thing. I wanted to go straight into, yeah, right, stating the obvious. I wanted to go into the Palestinian statehood issue. Ahmadinejad last night, of course, making his talk show circuit around usual rhetoric about Palestine, but really crucial rhetoric to hear in light of kind of the absence of this being talked about. I wanted to play that clip from Ahmadinejad.
When we say to be wiped, we say for occupation to be wiped off from this world, for war-seeking to be wiped off and eradicated, the killing of women and children to be eradicated, and we propose the way. We propose the path. The path is to recognize the right of the Palestinians to self-governance. Allow the people of Palestine to make decisions regarding their own future.
Why is it that Palestine is such an issue of contention for Iran, between Iran and Israel, and why does the U.S. feel like they need to be so intimately involved?
Well, the issue of Palestine is not an issue for Iran. Despite that moment from the Iranian president, from President Ahmadinejad, Iran has a concern with Israel. It doesn't have a concern with Palestine. I think that's rhetoric designed for his own base. And in that particular instance, President Ahmadinejad is explaining what his language means, that he's not saying we will wipe Israel off the face of the earth, which isn't a phrase that exists in Persian, but he's saying we will wipe oppression off the face of the earth. Fine. But the reality is Iran is not doing the Palestinians any favor. Ironically, the one thing that we can say Netanyahu has won in this battle over Iranian red lines, he has won a year in which no one, most notably his main sponsor, the United States, has not been pressuring for the end of occupation, for the end of Israel's denial of the right of return, for the end of Israeli apartheid, for the end of the siege of Gaza. We heard in 2010, for a few months, we heard President Obama making requests. Please stop building settlements. Answer from the Israelis? No. Please stop building settlements. Answer, no. Then the request stopped. If it was pressure, we would have heard, please stop building settlements. They're illegal. Answer, no. Okay, you're an independent country. You can do what you want. But you know that $4.1 billion of our tax money we give you every year? We're not doing that anymore. Right. And you know how we protect you in the United Nations so that no matter what resolutions are discussed or even passed, no one from Israel is ever really held accountable for your potential war crimes? We're not doing that anymore either. That's what pressure looks like. And we didn't see that. We haven't seen any of that.
So it's just been overshadowed kind of by the Iranian.
It's been overshadowed as long as the claim is being made that Israel, our great ally in the Middle East, is threatened with an existential threat from Iran. Nobody's going to talk about the occupation. The reality is Iran is not an existential threat to Israel. It is a threat. It's a threat to the Israeli nuclear monopoly. There is one country, as you know, in the Middle East right now that has nuclear weapons. It's not Iran, it's Israel. It has a large nuclear arsenal, which is not talked about by Israel. It's illegal for Israelis to talk about it. And the U.S. doesn't talk about it either. The Israeli nuclear arsenal is what is destabilizing the region, causing arms races, etc. All the things that we hear would happen if Iran got a nuclear weapon, which I certainly hope they don't. But the existing nuclear weapon that belongs to Israel is already causing that kind of problem.
It's kind of that underlying double standard. The rhetoric is really strong, and perhaps maybe a line should be drawn in terms of Palestinian statehood and halting the illegal occupation of Palestine.
What needs to happen is real diplomacy, not more of the same diplomacy that has failed for 21 years. The U.S. has led one kind of diplomacy that says face-to-face peace talks between the two sides is the only way we're going to get there. Well, the problem is you can't have peace talks when one side is the 23rd wealthiest country in the world, one of the most powerful, by far the most powerful military in the region, the only nuclear weapons in the region, and has the support of the world's sole superpower. And the other side is a group of people who are not recognized as a state, who are not allowed to control their own borders, who can't control who comes in and out, who can't control their own economy, who can't control anything surrounding them, who can't control their own diplomatic life. They can't declare themselves a state. And then you put those two at the table and say, now you talk about it. You know, that doesn't work. We need an entirely new kind of diplomacy that's based at the United Nations.
We do indeed. And thank you so much for coming on and breaking it down, Phyllis Bennis.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your time.